All right, welcome to Bet the Edge. I'm Jay Croucher here with Drew Dinsick. As always, today we're going to talk about the NFL preseason, first week of that, and any reflections, takeaways. Then we're going to break down all four teams in the NFC East. But let's start with the preseason, Drew. What was the biggest takeaway for you out of the first week?
Oh, well, looks like all the rookie quarterbacks can ball. That was an exhale of relief. We need we need to continue to have another injection of talented youth at the quarterback position in the NFL to keep the game kind of moving in the right direction as far as an entertainment standpoint goes. And, the first wave of evidence we got from the preseason games was positive, I think, on a lot of these guys. Certainly the Caleb Williams, highlights in terms of quick decision making and some of the, just really outlandish throws that he made, I thought was super positive to see that he can kind of step right in and be effective in week one. Similarly, Daniels, I thought looked the part for the Commanders. And then, fascinating to see how the Minnesota Vikings play this out now. My expectation is this is still 5 weeks of Sam Darnold's job. And probably that fifth week international test against the New York Jets is where the Vikings decide, hey, if we're 1-4, and Sam Darnold can't compete against the Jets defense, which is the best in the league, then at that point you probably start to, go plan B. But McCarthy looked live. Penix looked better than I had expected him to do. And, it's a bummer we're not going to see him play in the regular season unless something happens to Kirk Cousins. And we didn't get to see much of Drake May. That's maybe the one incomplete, but I saw enough of the Patriots otherwise to think that offense might actually be a little bit better than I had graded on paper, because some of the youth in that skill position group looks somewhat good. And so most of my kind of general preseason just experience, besides wanting to see the rookies and see what they look like in quasi NFL game action, most of it is specifically I go in with 10 units or so that I feel like are thin, and I'd like to see what just if that bears out in what you see in the preseason. Because if you have one or two skill position group guys that you think are going to contribute, Bengals is maybe a great example. So I had the Bengals skill group flagged as like this may be a thin group, and then you watch their preseason game, you're like, oh wait, no, they've got lots of depth, lots of interesting pieces. They're not names you would recognize. They don't jump off the paper when you look at the depth chart, but certainly I thought that unit was deeper than expected. And then there were some other ones where you have to downgrade, like the Atlanta pass rush. I was already very low on them. Now they lose another expected contributor. That unit has to be downgraded, probably the 32nd best in the league. And so basically just kind of going through unit by unit and making some small adjustments as you kind of went in thinking, this is a thin group. Let's see how their second unit guys do against third unit guys. And if it's not a good story, then you have to, kind of put that in pen. This is a thin unit, and then vice versa. So, overall, it was a really interesting set of games. Led, all the headlines being stolen by the quarterbacks, and I think for good reason, as with there's reason to be optimistic pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, I think the thing with preseason is that it needs to be looked at a little bit like summer league, where you should be expected to, particularly for these rookie quarterbacks who are going up against second stringers a lot of the time. Even some of the defensive players like Byron Murphy from Seattle looked awesome because he's like ragdolling third stringers. Like, that's good that he's dominating that level of competition, but it's difficult to read into what the step up will be going up against first stringers. And I think back to like Zach Wilson had awesome flashes in his first preseason with the Jets. Justin Fields was incredible in his first game in the preseason for the Bears before not having an amazing rookie season. So I think for the most part, preseason, particularly week one, where you're not seeing everyone, all the starters out there, or at least the biggest concentration of starters that you might see in the preseason, I think it's probably the information that you glean is more useful for like fantasy than for betting for the most part, where like there is stuff with fantasy that's, quite compelling in terms of usage and the fact that, Keon Coleman's playing like 100% of his snaps with the starters, like that stuff. And yeah, there are some betting takeaways from that in terms of like offensive rookie of the year markets. But for the most part, I think that the takeaways should mainly just be around injuries and then guys who look really bad. But I think like, I just don't know, like, I don't know what to read into like Bo Nix. Like, what does that mean? Like, he went 15 for 21, looked great against with second and third stringers. I just don't know what that really means. I think that like I do read into, some of the throws that Caleb Williams was able to make. But again, like we saw that at USC for the most part, and the fact that he's able to do it in the preseason, I think that's a huge surprise. Though,
Sure.
I did have quite a few people, well, maybe like 3 people, message me about Caleb Williams being 50-1 to win MVP, which I think that, he's got like the same odds as Christian McCaffrey. Like, who's more likely to win MVP, Caleb Williams or Christian McCaffrey? Like Caleb Williams, I think. And I mean, I would have said the same. I would have said that, CJ Stroud was more likely to win MVP than Christian McCaffrey. And then Christian McCaffrey is really one big half against Baltimore away from winning it last year. But I digress. I think that with Jaden Daniels, who got a lot of hype as well, and he had a crisp stat line in his drive where he's 2 for 3, 45 passing yards, has the dime down the right sideline to Diami Brown. I think the thing with Daniels is that, and then he has a design touchdown run as well. Like, everyone knows that he can run, and everyone knows that he can throw those deep balls. The thing with Daniels is, 1, is his body going to stand up, and then 2, can he actually like work the middle of the field, and can he not just like take off when pressure comes? So didn't really get a look at that so much. He threw the worst screen pass I've ever seen in my life to proceed the deep ball. So I just don't know that there's a great deal to read into this. Outside, it's good that these quarterbacks didn't look terrible.
Yes. That was my point. It was like, you came out of there thinking like, well, Trey Lance isn't going to work out. No. You come out of that game, sets the bed at the 4th. The Rams are in deep trouble if something happens to Matt Stafford. I think there are some conclusions you can draw about some of the quarterbacks we saw. I think in general, young quarterbacks, even, I don't take anything away from the Bo Nix because it was such vanilla looks he was getting. It was pretty just basic stuff he was doing. Certainly like, even Desmond Ridder. I mean, that was Spencer Rattler. Desmond Ridder looks like he might lose his backup job to Clayton Tune, which is amazingly what a fall from, hey, you're going to take a team that's going to win a playoff spot to, you now can't win a backup job against Clayton Tune. But no, Spencer Rattler, I thought even showed you something like he can, be a project to work on and deserves probably the backup job in New Orleans. But it was positive generally that you didn't have a lot of the game was going too fast, considering you were getting vanilla looks and second and third string defenses on the other side of the ball, pretty much across the stretch. I will say one thing as far as something that I was a little, kind of corner I'm already standing on, which is that Miami's going to be a pretty hot fade come mid-season. That field was atrocious already. That's a really, really bad sign for guys being able to avoid injuries. And so, like, if you, I don't play best ball, I would be very, very light on Tyreek Hill, honestly, expecting that he's going to be healthy and, kind of huge contributor in the month of December is a little bit of a stretch considering how bad that field looked. And then just similarly, like, Miami has so much talent. They're so deep, particularly on the offensive side of the ball. But boy, am I nervous about those guys getting hurt after what we saw. And yeah, this is preseason week 1. This is it's going to look all fall. That's not good.
Yeah. Well, good news then for Jalen Phillips, who just got off the PUP list. I'm sure he'll enjoy planting his freshly healed Achilles in that ground. But yeah, I mean, they're almost the most interesting second half type of team, just between availability of their key players who seem to get hurt. Tyreek Hill seems to get hurt in the second half of every season now, and just seeing how Tua will adapt from the trials of the second half of last season when it all kind of went off the rails. But I mean, that team still has like Super Bowl upside in theory, particularly now that like Jalen Phillips is back already, which was a concern that that might linger into the season, and the fact that he's back and don't know as much about Bradley Chubb. But I mean, that was the weakness on paper of the team, I think, outside of some questions on offensive line. The fact that Phillips, and we talked about it, I think, a week ago, but the workout videos, like I'm fully bought into Jalen Phillips' Achilles being fine. Like, I'm not sure you can do the agility stuff that he was doing unless it's pretty good to go. But yeah, they're a compelling team. All right, before we get to a less compelling team, arguably, in the New York Giants. Fantasy football season just got better this season, $1 million better. Create or join a private Yahoo Fantasy League and enter the $1 million NBC sweepstakes, plus earn extra entries to win when players on your fantasy roster score a touchdown during an opening weekend game on NBC or Peacock. Download the redesigned Yahoo Fantasy app or go to NBCSports.com/fantasymillion to learn more. All right, NFC East. Let's start off with my beloved New York Giants. Year 3 of the Brian Daboll experience. Year 1 was a lot better than year 2. The win total is 6.5. They are in the plus 360 to plus 450 range to make the playoffs. They're 18-1 to win the NFC East. They added Brian Burns, big trade, obviously, and they draft Malik Neighbors and they lose Saquon Barkley. Those are probably the 3 big personnel changes for the team. Do you think there is any upside in the Giants to rediscover their 9-7-1 glory of 2022?
I do. It's muted optimism, but there's definitely a there's definitely a path. I think the fact that they're, that just in general, the NFC East is a little unsettled, feels like, whereas years past we've come through and there's been 1 or 2 like bona fide contenders. You can see it, and then everybody else is fighting for scraps. This year, the top looks softer, which somebody should step into the void there. And there are parts of this particular Giants roster that you can hold up as elite across the NFL. Largely their ability to create pressure with the defensive line, anchored by, I would say, a clear top 5 guy, if not recognized as that, and Dexter Lawrence anchoring the middle there. Now kind of helped by Brian Burns and Kayvon Thibodeau, as this should be a very effective pass rush. Now, that's only really going to help you put away leads. And are you going to be having many leads in games if you're not an effective offense, and or if your coverage is getting just absolutely cooked? Because the weaknesses on the Giants team start with, for me at least, with the coverage. This looks like a unit that could get exploited pretty early and often. And I worry very much about their ability to get off the field as teams are driving, consistently on them with completions through the air. And then the offensive side of the ball, huge questions still about what to make of this offensive line. This is one of the least cohesive units of the last several years. They didn't really make any investments in the offseason that moved the needle for me. They're just expecting some of these young guys to take meaningful steps forward, and a guy that they have a monster amount of draft capital in, and Evan Neal can't start. Like, they're going to have to lean into Illuminor, who's come over with the offensive line coach from the Raiders, to try to salvage what was one of the more poor units across the NFL last year, maybe second worst only to Tennessee. So Andrew Thomas being back and having a full offseason, maybe he is a good enough anchor at left tackle that you can get the type of protection that helped Daniel Jones break out 2 years ago. Daniel Jones certainly looks fine. I haven't seen anything to suggest that some of the issues that were plaguing him last year, and then ultimately his injury that cost him the end of the season, I'm not seeing like any evidence that he's going to have any shadow of that. And he should have a much more effective pass catching group to work with this year, considering the investment they made in Malik Neighbors at the top of the draft, and the development they've done with Jalen Hyatt as a deep threat, and Wan'Dale Robinson and Darius Slayton as possession guys. Like, this is like kind of a middle of the pack, at least, if not maybe with upside if Malik Neighbors breaks out as a wide receiver 1 skill position group. And you put that with Daniel Jones, who's at times capable of really being effective on the ground, moving the ball, then yeah, maybe this offense is league average. And if that happens, there are soft enough portions of their schedule that I could see them getting into the mix, at least, kind of around Thanksgiving. Maybe we're talking about a team that's, in the hunt for a wild card spot. And if that's the case, and, you continue to improve down the stretch, then yeah, why not? But ultimately, I think it's pretty fair to have them towards the bottom tier of NFC teams this year. But I do think the market kind of rating them in the same ballpark as Washington, maybe a miss. I think they're better than the Commanders.
Yeah, I don't feel great about it, but if I were to bet on one team at current price to win this division, it would be the Giants, just because it's kind of like the it's not quite the same, but there's a little bit of NBA Southeast Division equity about the NFC East, where it's like
Surely.
none of these teams seem that scary. So why, as a team that has realistic aspirations of competence, why are they 18-1, where there's only 3 teams they have to finish ahead of, and one of them in Washington doesn't look like it's going to be very good, particularly when one of the teams in particular in Dallas, which we'll get to, is so top heavy and perhaps higher variance than your typical team, set at, around 10 wins as a win total. I think with the Giants, they're interesting because they are so, as you mentioned, their strengths are so pronounced, where, yeah, they have a great defensive line, but the secondary is atrocious. Like, they really need Deontay Banks to become something. Like, he's a first-round pick a year ago and didn't have a good rookie season, but, I wouldn't close the door on him being any good. And then the offensive line, like, Daniel Jones is a weird guy to evaluate because last year, I just don't think he had a chance behind that offensive line. Like, some of those games are just a total joke. Like the San Francisco game back in the first month of the season, like, you just didn't have a prayer. Like, there's nothing. Like, if guys are losing their blocks in like 1 second, then all right, it's just game over. Like, what can you do? I do worry a little bit just coming off the injury that. One, I worry a little bit that, like, he just looked like a broken man in terms of the O-line being just breaking down constantly last season, where if that has infected, his psyche and his confidence to stand in the pocket a little bit, because it did seem like it had affected him where he was just hearing footsteps. And I'm not sure that is definitely going to go away. And then the other thing too is that he is so dependent, I think, on his legs and his rushing ability to provide, real value, where, like, that was a huge part of his 2022 season. I think back to that game where they sewed up the playoff spot beating the Colts. Like, they did that with Daniel Jones on the ground and his value rushing. And it's always a weird thing because he doesn't look that fast. He can't kind of draw up a running quarterback who looks less like, Lamar Jackson or whatever. But he does provide value with his legs and off the ACL if he doesn't have supreme confidence in that. Like in 2022, which was his, the best season of his career, the year that made them sign him to this big contract. Like, he only threw for 15 touchdown passes through the air. Like, the real separator for him was, one, avoiding turnovers. He had like a 1% interception rate, which is very fluky, but also the value on the ground. So I think that Jones is obviously a question mark, but I think he can probably be somewhat confident that he's going to provide like average, slightly below average starting quarterback play. And then the questions really are the secondary is a Banks, and these are like Cordell Flott, which is not a name that inspires confidence, just orally or in terms of what he's actually put out on the field. I think that, yeah, they're going to have to step up and provide this group a semblance of competence. And then just the offensive line, because there is a pathway for the O-line to be competent where, more health for Andrew Thomas, who's an elite left tackle. These guys that they've brought in, like, it's not amazing, but at least like Illuminor and Van Roten and John Runyon, like, those guys are a lot better than what, they were trotting out last year. So there is some hope there. But I mean, what do you think about this team's like upside? Do they actually have upside to get to the, probably minimum 10 wins that they would need to compete for the division?
Not on their own. Right? They're going to need help. Right?
Yeah.
And I think you
can be an 8 win team that backs its way into 10 just with, lucky bounces.
Exactly. And I think that if the lucky bounces happen against Philadelphia, then yes. If the lucky bounces happen against teams that you were 50-50 with anyway, then probably no. Their schedule overall is not especially scary up until you get to the very end, where you get at Dallas, Baltimore, at Atlanta, at Philly, all kind of in the final 6 weeks of the season. And I mean, if you're not winning sort of those middle stretch of games, including games like at Washington and at Pittsburgh versus Washington, at Carolina, right, versus Minnesota, even week 1, where you're a small favorite, or pick 'em depending on where you look. Like, if you're not winning your coin flip games early, then I think really the mission changes for the end of the season with these guys, right? because you're not interested in incidentally getting Daniel Jones hurt again and having him on the hook for what looks likely to be a year where you're not interested in keeping him. So, yeah, I think fundamentally, if you're losing your coin flips in the early portion of the season, and I would circle mostly that game like week 7, where you're hosting Philadelphia and you're only 3.5 point dogs on the look ahead line, and Philadelphia may be looking a little past you in that particular matchup. Like if you can capture that one and then win your coin flips, then maybe the end of the season looks a little bit like, hey, we're going to try to make a push here, as opposed to, hey, we're going to put Daniel Jones on ice so it doesn't cost us, because the vision, the mission, everything changes if you get to about Thanksgiving and you're not competing.
Yep, agreed. All right, let's go to the Cowboys, who won the NFC East, much to my delight at the end of last season, where I just still don't really understand how they won the division. Well, I guess it's because the Eagles just completely imploded, and we'll get to that. But their win total this year, 10.5. They're minus 200 range to make the playoffs. They've drifted to, I mean, they opened around pick to win the division. Now they're out to plus 155. And beyond to go back to back. They're 19-1 to win the Super Bowl. They didn't really do anything in the offseason, famously. They've let Stephon Gilmore walk. Doesn't seem like he is coming back. They added Eric Kendricks. Maybe the biggest change of note is Dan Quinn leaving as defensive coordinator and bringing in Mike Zimmer after the inglorious, to say the least, performance against the Packers in the playoffs. CD Lamb holding out with his contract. It seems like that is going to be resolved. Some kind of banking that he will be out there. They lose Jonathan Hankins, who, he's Jonathan Hankins. It's not the biggest deal, but that's probably the most glaring weakness on the team, is that the interior of the defensive line that, got run all over by the Packers and other teams last season. I think this is one of the highest variance teams in the league, just because so much is based on 3 players in Dak, CD, and Parsons. And also, in a way, kind of 4 players with Trayvon Diggs, who actually is probably the biggest addition, given that he was playing like an elite top 10 corner before he tore his ACL last season. So where do you sit on the Cowboys divide? Because it feels like they're probably the most popular fade at the moment in the market.
Yeah. I haven't taken any positions against them, but I'm there. And it's tough, because usually when you have a team that the underlying metrics from last year tell you that there's some real there, there's good there, and you have kind of the anchors, like you have a legitimate quarterback, you have a top 3 skill position guy, you have a top 1 defensive player on your team. Like the rest should be a little bit of gravy. But this was a lost offseason. I don't understand the vision. I don't understand the degree to which there was no urgency to get anything done to lock down your core. If you've drafted and developed Dak, like you're making things easier on yourself. If you draft and develop CD Lamb and Micah Parsons, you've made the whole process, you've made it all easier on yourself. Like this is how teams like the Steelers famously, like this is how they have had regular success over multiple years in a salary cap era, is because they've done a good job of identifying talent, developing those guys, and getting them on team friendly contracts. And somehow that's not what we're looking at with the process that the Dallas Cowboys are going through right now. And I mean, you want a red flag? The fact that CeeDee Lamb has missed all of camp to this point, even if they do get a deal done, like, are you going to be surprised if week 2 he's questionable with the soft tissue injury? No, of course not. Like this is something that happens every year. It's predictable. And I think in general, like the fact that even that behind CeeDee Lamb, it is a huge question mark in terms of who's going to contribute on the offensive side of the ball. Your running back room is a joke, and I know I'm not ever going to hold that up as a reason to be on or against the team, but certainly the idea of any kind of a balanced offense is out the window. You're going to have to get it all done through the air, and there are going to be teams that you go up against on your schedule who have elite CB1s, and they're going to make it tough for you to be as effective getting the ball to CeeDee Lamb, your only playmaker. And I think ultimately that could be what holds this offense back. Not really a Mike McCarthy guy in any way, shape, or form. Not a Brian Schottenheimer guy in any way, shape, or form. I think a lot of people were coming into the season expecting to bet on the defense on the upswing, thanks to the switch to Mike Zimmer, just because it's a fresh voice in the room, and he was able to succeed so effectively with Minnesota and Cincinnati when he had talent that was not as good as the talent that is on this defense. But you're right. The run stop looks like a huge question mark to me. The entire linebacking core has issues from what I can tell you. And, don't exactly know how they're going to utilize Micah Parsons, but it doesn't really look outside of DeMarcus Lawrence like he has a lot of help on that D line to absorb anything better than double teams every obvious passing down. So, there are questions swirling on both offense and defense about what exactly the ceiling of this team is. And I think it's been mismanaged and mishandled. And I don't really understand why, because again, like you were set up to be, absolutely awesome for years to come around the core that you developed, and somehow they've bottled this. And I have downgraded a number of units for the Cowboys between the start of my process and where we stand now. Very concerned that you went into this, season expecting to start two rookies, and now looks like both guys are long shots to be your starting players, which means you're going to have to immediately backfill with second string guys who haven't had continuity in terms of snaps with the rest of this O line. If you are going to be strong in two places on the offensive line, I'm not sure I'm super psyched that those two places are left guard and right guard. I think you have definitely issues with going up against elite edge rushers, which exist in your division and on your schedule in all over the place. So typically when a team like the Cowboys goes out with such a phenomenal fanfare as they did last year, way earlier than people were expecting, I'm like waiting in the weeds, going to buy low. People forget how good this team is, but after all the downgrades I've made, considering the way they've rostered this team and really the continued confusing nature by which they're not locking down their core, has me a little bit on the outs right now. I think I have them just better than a 3-point team. That is to say 3 points better than average team on a neutral, which puts them in the conversation with a lot of other good, not great teams. And you have a lame duck coach in Mike McCarthy, who probably isn't coming back if they don't win multiple playoff games. And honestly, I think they're going to have to do it on the road because the gap between you and Philadelphia now in terms of talent is meaningful. So, a lot of things are going to have to go right for me to completely change my tune on this Dallas team. And ultimately, there's only a few bright spots I can really point to where I think, they could surprise to the good as we look at the calendar and I think at their schedule. And I think we're probably going to be looking at a team that is scrambling down the home stretch against some bad teams to get enough wins to get in as a wild card.
Yeah, I think this is like one of the ultimate teams, the way you bet on the tail outcomes, just because, like we talked about, the talent is just so concentrated on the top and they're so health dependent. Where, I mean, if everyone stays healthy, they should have, an elite pass rush, really good secondary, an elite quarterback, a top 5 wide receiver in the sport, an offensive line that is probably the shakiest that it's been in a while. And I think they're really going to need to count on Tyler Guyton to come and step in at left tackle almost immediately, which is a bit of a problem because coming out of the draft, the book on him was that he was a bit of a project, though the talk in camp has been really positive on Guyton. So, talk in camp has been really positive about Quentin Johnston as well, and he didn't get into the Chargers game until the third drive. So we'll see about that. But I think the other thing too about the Cowboys is I usually fade the notion that a team is the team is a front runner, or they're a flat track bully and they only beat the bad teams because for the most part, like, it is very instructive, just absolutely destroying bad teams. Like, that has, for the most part, statistically borne out that is just as good as, a narrow win over a good team or whatever in terms of it being predictive. The Dallas Cowboys might be the exception. Just having watched this team with my own eyes, like, you look back and it's not just last year where I don't think they had any super impressive win. I mean, they beat... they blew out the Eagles when the Eagles were absolutely spiraling. They beat the Lions by 1 in Dallas in a game that they should have lost. Had the correct call being made on the 2-point conversion at the end. And then outside of that, they got absolutely destroyed by the Niners. They got destroyed and embarrassed by Buffalo. And then they obviously get crushed by Green Bay. And then even you look back to the year prior, what were their impressive wins in 2022? It was the exact same thing. to be fair, they were very impressive, just completely destroying the Bucs in the first week of the playoffs, which everyone forgets that game. That like Dak Prescott, for all his sins in the playoffs, and there have been many sins that he will have to atone for at some point in his life, but he ended Tom Brady's career. And he did it with like a 10 out of 10 performance, and they just absolutely destroyed them. But outside of that, and that Bucs team was like 8-9, so it's not like they were going up against world beaters. But I mean, there definitely is a front running aspect to this team. The way that I would bet the Cowboys is, if you look at their schedule, in their first 10 weeks, they have to play 6 division favorites. There's only 8 divisions in the NFL, and the Cowboys have to play 6 of the favorites in the first 10 weeks. It's absolutely horrific. And then after that, it lightens up significantly, where in their final 7 weeks, they get to play Washington twice. They get to play the Giants, the Panthers, home against the Bucs. Like, they should come home with a wet sail. So that would be I just wouldn't get involved in anything Cowboys at the moment. And then I would wait and hope that they're somewhat in range. And if after 10 weeks, they're 5-5 or they're 4-6 and they've gone out to like 50-1 to win the Super Bowl, because this team definitely has Super Bowl winning upside for all their problems. So that would be the way that I would approach the Cowboys, is that hope that they get off to a scuffling start, and then bet on the tail outcomes once they get through this ridiculous stretch. I mean, at one point they go Detroit, at San Francisco, at Atlanta, Philly, Houston. Like, that's brutal. And even before that, they have games, against Baltimore. They open the season at Cleveland. Like, it's not good for the Cowboys overall.
It's not good for the Cowboys. And the buy low point is after that Houston game that you mentioned. That's a Monday Night Football game. I personally think their matchup against Houston is bad. Stingley wiping CeeDee Lamb off the map, and the Cowboys just looking completely broken on offense. Like, you don't have to squint that hard. It kind of will look like that, I think. And at that point, like, which one of the weapons at that point does CJ Stroud want to hurt you with? There's definitely a chance for that to be sort of the buy low, I think, on the Cowboys. And then you're buying them before they get the Giants on Thanksgiving, where they're right now, look ahead, would say they're going to be about an 8-point favorite. Also down the home stretch, they got at Carolina, where they're expected to be a 7-point favorite, hosting Tampa Bay, where they're expected to be a favorite, end the season versus Washington. And so really, like, that final 6-game stretch, you can talk yourself into 5-1 if you can get the win at Philly, which I know is not a given, but certainly to me looks like a team that you bet on upside, but you wait for the market to just completely give up on them, because right now, like, there is already a little bit of built-in downside to expectation.
Yeah, look, you don't want to play my Panthers in week 15, because by that point, coach of the year Dave Canales will have completely fixed Bryce Young, and they will be surging into the playoffs at 9-8. All right, the RotoWorld Draft Guide is here for you during the peak of draft season, and this year it has added features available exclusively through a new partnership with Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life. Get a Fantasy Life Plus subscription and receive the RotoWorld Draft Guide to help you crush your competition. Use promo code ROTO10 for 10% off and unlock extensive fantasy, DFS, and betting tools now. Go to NBCSports.com/fantasylife to learn more. All right, Washington Commanders, typically are set at 6.5 wins, which it feels like they've been set at ever since Robert Griffin III tore his ACL. They're plus 260 to make the playoffs, which I'd say to the average NFL fan would seem a little bit short, but they do play in the NFC, which is somewhat unthreatening, at least relative to the AFC. Their odds to win the NFC East vary from like 8-1 out to 14-1. For the true optimists, they are 121 to win the Super Bowl, which they will not be doing this year. Obviously, they added Jaden Daniels, which is the big addition, and he creates all of their upside. They added like competence to the defense. They added a lot of name players like Bobby Wagner and Austin Eckler on offense. Not really significant losses. A lot of their losses came mid-season last year, losing Chase Young and Montez Sweat. Any optimism for a Commanders team that there's like a lot of names on this team between, Jane Daniels won the Heisman, Dan Quinn has made a Super Bowl as head coach for, Cliff Kingsbury is a big name. Brian Johnson was randomly like on this team as a coach after the debacle in Philadelphia. There's just like a lot of names on this team, but do you think will add up to anything?
I don't. Not this year, at least. Couple of thoughts. Dan Quinn, I thought, failed his first task as head coach, which was hiring Cliff Kingsbury. I don't. I mean, if you're going to go out and try to build an offense, I don't really know why you would go retread instead of, you get a young innovator to pair with your dynamic quarterback. But we'll see. Nothing about what Cliff Kingsbury has done in his tenure as an NFL coach has really, in my opinion, warranted consideration for this role. So maybe I'm just low on him, but the additions that the team made through free agency, I thought were very weird and kind of not really guided by like process, especially. And if you think of, well, what is going on there? Well, you have new ownership that's taken over. You have guys they've put in place to evaluate players and contracts, and they were just kind of spraying a little bit. And they're getting guys who I think are past their primes and or maybe a little bit inflated based on reputation, as opposed to guys who can step in and like really change the culture there. I look at a guy like Bobby Wagner, and as amazing as he was for so much of his career, and he's probably going to the Hall of Fame and should be, first opportunity Ring of Honor in Seattle. Like his last 2 years, particularly on third downs and coverage, were just automatic first downs for the other team. And I really don't know how this defense, anchored with linebackers that have coverage issues, is going to succeed when you have as many weaknesses as you do on the backside. All three starting cornerbacks, I have questions about. Both of yours, I think you downgraded in safety, going from Cam Curl to Jeremy Chin. This is really, it was a really strange offseason in terms of what they added, and basically every move they made in free agency, I was just kind of like, yeah, I wouldn't have done that. Now they could all come together, and you could have a lot of vets who are playing capable football and surprise to the good, led by a breakout from Daniels, and I think that's kind of what they're hoping for. But again, without really seeing much in terms of innovation out of Cliff Kingsbury, I just don't know that it's happening in year one here. So I was somewhat warm-ish on this skill position group coming into this off season. Or coming into this preseason, and I've since gotten a little spooked by how thin this group is. I've gotten a little spooked by some of the issues on the offensive line that are already being manifest. There's strength in the interior of your D line, in Deron Payne and Jonathan Allen, and then there is nothing else that I'm really excited about what they're going to be running out on the defensive side of the ball. And so I think heading into this season, this is probably going to be my lowest ranked defense. And maybe that's not right. Maybe that's not fair, but that's going to put Daniels in a situation where he's going to be in comeback mode a lot this season. And he's going to be asked to do a lot in terms of just filling up the stat sheet. And so I think there is probably a little bit of a kind of a plus to his rookie of the year case in that regard. And that, he could be a guy that I think health and just ability to stay on the field is going to be key. Like 17 starts from him, his stat line is probably going to look like ridiculous, and it's just going to be on its face, because he's facing a lot of defenses that are playing playing a little bit back, just in general, trying to prevent the home run play. And if he's able to set all time, if he's able to break Robert Griffin III's rookie quarterback rushing record, for instance, something like that, and Caleb Williams doesn't have clear advantage over him in terms of wins as the starting quarterback, then I can see a case where he ultimately wins the tiebreak there. And I know we've talked about it a dozen times, I feel like, but Caleb Williams' schedule down the stretch looks troubling to me. Whereas if Washington can scuffle up 2-3 wins down the stretch, particularly at home against some dome teams or some warm weather teams, then it could be enough to sort of flip the narrative to their building into the end of their season, and that could be enough to get Daniels the O'Roy from Caleb Williams. But just generally, this is one of my lowest power rated teams across the NFL, and I think it's being dragged down largely because I think this is one of the worst, if not the worst, defense.
Yeah. So here's the bull case for Washington. It would be that Dan Quinn is a defensive-minded head coach. The Cowboys last year had the 4th-ranked defense by EPA per play regular season. That'll go down if you use the Packers game in the playoffs on top of that. And the Cowboys didn't play a particularly terrifying schedule, but still defensive-minded head coach. and through just, luck that all defenses can benefit or suffer from. Like, it wouldn't be, even if they don't have a great deal of talent, like to get to slightly below average. It doesn't take a ton for any defense really to get to slightly below average with a bit of luck. And then on offense, I think the offensive line is sneakily kind of competent, outside of a big question mark at left tackle, which is the most important position. But still, I think the other 4 spots look okay. And then you have Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, you have upside through Jaden Daniels. So I think there are worlds where this team could have a really good offense and a defense that lucks its way to competence. And then all of a sudden, the team, if a little bit of a fluke, gets to 9-8, 10-7, or gets a wild card, which isn't crazy for a team that is 6.5 wins. So a question to you, Drew, is, so offshore, the Commanders are plus 360 to make the playoffs. You can bet 5K. Anyone can bet 5K risk on that to win 18 grand. So it's a decent limit. So it's somewhat liquid. And Dan Quinn is 30-1 to win Coach of the Year. Do you think that Dan Quinn, just doing the math on that, do you think Dan Quinn is more than a 15% chance to win Coach of the Year if the Commanders make the playoffs?
So funny enough, I bet that before I finished my homework, and
right.
I would, if you want it, you can have it.
What price did you bet?
I think I got 35, but it still is like, I can't even tell you, man. This defense scares the ever-loving bitches out of me. They are going to, because like, at least they can't really cover, but they also can't rush the passer. So I think that there's going to be a painful sort of teams converting long third downs against this group. That's going to really get frustrating. And maybe Dan Quinn elevates them. I have always thought he's always been able to do something special every stop he's been, as far as getting a defense to perform better than the sum of their parts. And like it was eye-raising to me that they went out and got like Dorrance Armstrong and Dante Fowler Jr. Like, they're bringing them over from Dallas. You're literally like, okay, well, I mean, if Dan's bringing them over, like, is that just for culture, or did he think that he saw something more than the market was ever going to see in those guys, and so he thinks he got them at a buy low? Like, I'm always intrigued by those types of moves, and maybe they get a decent pass rush out of them compared with their interior defensive tackles, who I have huge respect for. So it's going to kind of come down to if they hit on some of these rookies, because they got a steal in Newton where they got him, and he might end up being a contributor. They got a steal in San Francisco where they got him, in terms of just pedigree and expectation where those guys were going to get drafted and where they ultimately took them. And so that could be a positive, and they could have somebody from this linebacking core step up and step into these roles in place of Wagner and Luvu, and maybe I'm looking at this defense a little differently, but right now I'm just not sure how they're getting off the field.
Yep, fair. Last thing before we move to the Eagles, when I was at the Combine in Indy earlier this year, was out with some NFL media people, and Dan Quinn was around, and it wasn't just because he was there, but I was kind of shocked by NFL media people absolutely adore Dan Quinn. He's totally beloved. He's just like this super laid back, universally liked guy, and I think that stuff kind of does matter a bit for Coach of the Year things, where as opposed to, and like, I don't know what NFL media people think of, like, Dennis Allen, but I don't think that he has like the personality of like a Dan Quinn who is really well liked. So, it matters around the margins. I don't think 35-1 is a bad price at all. All right, let's close out with the Eagles, year 3 of Nick Sirianni, who's probably not as beloved as Dan Quinn. I can say confidently, their win total is 10.5. They are minus 250 to make the playoffs. They have shortened rapidly to win the NFC East, from minus 110 out to some places they're minus 150, 15-1 to win the Super Bowl. A ton of offseason movement. The biggest names coming in: Saquon Barkley, Bryce Huff, adding Cooper DeJean, Quinion Mitchell through the draft to address the secondary. They lose Hassan Reddick, who we'll see what Hassan Reddick does this year, and they lose Jason Kelsey as well, who retired, obviously. What do you think of this team's prospects and their upside, and also their floor in terms of winning the division?
Okay, so in my opinion, they're a top 3 offense. In my opinion, they're a top 16. This is all kind of evaluating player level, unit level, sum of the parts. And there is no team, in my opinion, that has a higher likelihood of not equaling the sum of the parts, if that makes sense. And I cannot really tell you that there is like a reason to think that things are going to fall apart. But I can tell you that when a coach like Sirianni has to fire both coordinators, really three coordinators, and when a coach like Sirianni is scuffling to the tune of "I'm going to hire Matt Patricia, fix the defense," right? Like if you know there were a lot of signs down the stretch last year that just suggested that like he's kind of lost any kind of vote of confidence in that locker room. You pair that with the likes of Kelsey moving on, Fletcher Cox moving on, and just in general a turnover of some of the leadership. And now, like this, kind of feels like a little bit of a leadership vacuum in the locker room. A coach who is not especially well liked or regarded, and you're going to try to, you're going to try to get the most out of a defense that has been, rehabilitated on paper very, very effectively. Like Howie Roseman did quite an impressive job of turning around a defense that had huge holes on paper. And now it's kind of like, wow, well, they've got lots of options. They can figure this out. But there is a long history of players not especially loving playing for Vic Fangio, particularly early on when they're, kind of asked to do, just a huge change of their way they play football. And so, yeah, there are warning signs surely that the Eagles ultimately have another season like last year where something goes wrong at some point in the season and the leadership vacuum and the lack of confidence in the coach costs them ultimately reaching their potential, which could very well be like in the conversation with the Niners as likely NFC championships based on the talent on this team. Like the offensive line still looks amazing. The wide receiver room, one of the best, if not the best in football. Jalen Hurts, a dynamic two-way player who, has I think largely been, kind of understood in season now 2 years in a row as a guy who was in the mix for your MVP, and then ultimately didn't get it because of the losses that the team suffered at the wrong time of the year, combined with the fact that last year I think he was dealing with some pretty meaningful injuries that affected his rushing ability. So, I think ultimately, if they get off to if you're talking about get off to a good start, you got an early bye, you win some of your high leverage games in the middle of the season, and you finish soft as can be. Carolina, Pittsburgh, Washington, Dallas, New York Giants, like you are going to be heavy favorites in 4 out of those 5 games, maybe all 5. And I think ultimately, if they can kind of get through the difficult parts of their season without the locker room kind of coming apart, this is a team that's going to be in the mix to win a Super Bowl. And then the other side of the coin is it doesn't work out from just a chemistry standpoint. The team players quit on Sirianni, and you could see a situation where there's some significant turnover again in the coaching staff for next year. I don't have an especially strong read on what we're going to get with Kellen Moore. I don't have an especially strong read as to whether Saquon Barkley is going to be the addition people have been putting him in with this team, because to me, at least, he doesn't really fit a boomer bust player on the type of team that's going to go for, that just wants 3 yards on 3rd and 4 so that they can get their 4th and 1, game plan out there. But all that said, I think, the talent that exists across certainly the offense and, with upside on the defense, this is a team that should be thinking Super Bowl this year, I think.
Yep. I'm going to make a prediction that this team is going to be like the 2021 Philadelphia 76ers. That was the team that got the 1 seed that went 49-23, and they just kept on racking up regular season wins. And the whole time, people had this gnawing suspicion that Simmons and Embiid just still don't work together. And there's just something slightly off about this team. And I think the Eagles are going to rack up regular season wins. They'll go 11-6, 12-5, and then they'll lose in embarrassing fashion to the Trae Young Hawks in round 2. Where it just feels like, to your point, that there's a lot of, it's like really good team roster building, like all these, like, yeah, you added in the secondary in the draft where that was the weakest point to get DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell. That's great. You add Saquon Barkley, who's the best running back that Jalen Hurts has played with, even though it's weird that such an analytically focused organization shelled out that much for a running back. You got Bryce Huff in for Hassan Reddick. That makes sense. Even like getting like Isaiah Rodgers, who was sneakily pretty competent for the Colts. Like, it all makes sense. It just feels like something intangible is slightly off with this team. But I think the floor is just so high in terms of regular season win accumulation. I just think it's just so weird the way that the team completely collapsed last year. It just doesn't make sense to me that is going to be completely rectified. I think I don't understand with Hurts, like what exactly happened to him with his knee, with the way that he just seemed to completely break down against the blitz, and whether that's just a weakness in his game where he just is unable to solve the blitz. Maybe that just ruins him. So, I mean, yeah, I would be betting high floor outcomes and not betting. If you can get -110 for the Eagles to win the division, I think that is a bet. It's also just like violently off market compared to other places, but that price is still out there and available. So that would be my bet on this team, and then I would wait a little bit to bet the higher end outcomes like the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I dig it. Speaking of higher end outcomes, had a funny moment over the week. We were doing a live, live awards talk, and just pulled the hot circa numbers, just fresh printed numbers, and Jalen Hurts was 33-1, and I basically let out a gasp of how is that possible? 33-1, like that's got to get fixed. And somebody in the room corrected it out from under me. So I have no skin in Jalen Hurts MVP, despite finding a very off market price for it, 33-1. Do you think I guess just what has to happen this year? Do you think that my commentary about him having been somewhat anchored now, like 2 years in a row, like, the market kind of made him the clear favorite at a portion of the season where the Eagles were winning, like, is that enough to kind of keep him in the mix if the Eagles are just winning games because they have a super team?
Yeah, definitely. I think if the Eagles go 14-3, 13-4, they're the 1 seed, then Hurts is he's kind of a made man because he's been an MVP candidate 2 years in a row. They made the Super Bowl. He played really well in the Super Bowl. I think he's in that like third tier. If you say tier 1 is like Mahomes and tier 2 is Allen and Burrow, I think Hurts is in that next tier with, Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, those type of guys. So yeah, definitely worlds where Hurts can win MVP. I think he's pretty appropriately priced right now in the 16-1 type of range. So it's a shame you didn't get 33-1.
Yeah.
Anyway, we are done for now. Don't forget to check out NBCSports.com for more information to help you with your wagers. Thanks to those watching on the NBC Sports YouTube channel. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, don't forget to rate and subscribe. Also, a reminder to find all your favorite NBC Sports shows on Amazon Music. Just head to amazon.com/NBC Sports. From Jay Croucher and Drew Dinsick, we'll be back later this week.